Many people believe they already know the story of Napoleon's wars. Pick up almost any textbook or watch a documentary, and you will usually encounter the same account. An ambitious little Corsican general seized power, crowned himself emperor, and then decided to conquer Europe because his ego demanded it. He fought brilliant battles, won most of them, marched into Russia like a fool, and eventually lost at Waterloo because he overreached. It is a tidy narrative. It's dramatic, but it misrepresents much of what actually drove those wars. The deeper story of Napoleon's wars is not simply about one man's ambition. It's about money. It's about banking systems. It's about trade routes and currency manipulation and the invisible architecture of financial power that was already reshaping Europe long before Napoleon ever picked up a sword. The Napoleonic Wars were more than a sequence of military campaigns. They were the violent surface expression of the deepest economic conflict of the modern era. A war between two fundamentally different visions of how wealth, trade, and power should flow across the world. And the man that historians love to cast as the instigator, Napoleon Bonaparte, was in many ways reacting to forces that had been set in motion more than a century before he was born. To understand the deeper origins of Napoleon's wars, set the battlefields aside for a moment. Forget Austerlitz, forget Waterloo, forget the Russian winter. Instead, trace the flow of money. Once you follow those financial connections, a very different picture begins to appear. It's one that most historians either ignore, downplay, or simply don't understand. Let's start not in 1799, the year Napoleon seized power, but more than 100 years earlier in 1688. That was the year of the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, when the Dutch Prince William of Orange crossed the English Channel, deposed King James II, and took the English throne alongside his wife Mary. On the surface, this appears to be primarily a religious and political event, Protestants replacing a Catholic king. Beneath the surface, however, something even more consequential was taking place. William of Orange didn't just bring Protestant rule to England, he brought the Dutch financial system. Before William arrived, England's finances were, to put it bluntly, a mess. The crown borrowed money from goldsmiths and private lenders at extortionate rates, and there was no systematic way to fund large-scale military operations. But the Dutch had spent decades perfecting something revolutionary. They had created the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, they had pioneered public debt instruments, they had invented limited liability, they had turned capital markets into a weapon of state power. And when William took the English throne, he transplanted those ideas into the heart of British governance. Within 6 years of William's arrival, England had the Bank of England established in 1694. This was not merely a bank, it was a machine for turning private wealth into public war funding. The Bank of England allowed the British government to borrow at low interest rates by issuing government bonds called consols that investors could buy and sell freely. Britain suddenly gained access to what was, in practical terms, an enormous and renewable war chest. As long as the economy was producing, as long as investors had confidence, the government could keep borrowing and keep fighting. This was the financial innovation that would define the next 120 years of European conflict. And this is a point that is often overlooked. From 1689 to 1815, Britain and France fought each other in what some scholars call the Second Hundred Years' War. It was not a single conflict, but a continuing sequence of wars. The 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, and finally the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Viewed together, those conflicts reveal a pattern. These weren't separate conflicts driven by different causes. They were chapters in a single sustained economic struggle between two empires competing for global dominance. One empire, Britain, had a financial system capable of sustaining long wars through public credit. The other empire, France, did not. That imbalance shaped much of what followed. Now let's talk about what was happening inside France, because this is where the conventional narrative really starts to fall apart. By the end of the 1780s, France was bankrupt. Not figuratively, but effectively and literally bankrupt. The French government owed more money than it could ever hope to repay, and a massive portion of that debt came from a single decision: France's support of the American Revolution. Consider the irony for a moment. France helped the American colonies break free from Britain, not out of some philosophical commitment to liberty. It was a strategic play to weaken the British Empire. And it worked. Britain lost its American colonies, but the cost of that victory destroyed the French treasury. The French monarchy had spent roughly 1.3 billion livres supporting the American war effort, money it borrowed at crushing interest rates because France had nothing like the Bank of England to offer investors confidence in public debt. By 1789, the interest payments alone on France's national debt consumed more than half of all government revenue. The price of bread had doubled. Tax collection was inefficient and deeply unfair, with the aristocracy and clergy largely exempt. The common people were starving, while the court at Versailles continued to spend lavishly. When the Estates General was called in the spring of 1789, it wasn't because the French people had suddenly read too much Voltaire and decided they wanted democracy. The immediate reason was that the government had run out of money. At its core, the French Revolution began as a fiscal crisis that expanded into a political one. And here is where the story takes a turn that changes everything about how we should understand Napoleon's wars. The revolution created an entirely new kind of financial chaos. The revolutionary government, desperate for cash, seized the Catholic Church's vast land holdings and used them as backing for a new paper currency called the assignat. At first, the idea seemed clever. There were about 400 million livres worth of assignats issued, backed by confiscated land, but the government couldn't resist printing more. By 1793, the total money in circulation had ballooned to nearly 3 billion francs, more than double the original amount raised from the confiscations. By 1795, the money supply had exploded to roughly 4.4 billion francs, and the francs' exchange rate against the British pound had collapsed by 45%. By the time the revolutionary government known as the Directory took power, total assignats in circulation had mushroomed to approximately 20 billion francs. And on top of that, the government had issued bonds for another 50 billion. Prices for basic goods had increased by 500 times or more compared to 1790 levels. France was being overwhelmed by hyperinflation. The assignat had become essentially worthless. People were rioting for bread. The economy had effectively collapsed. And this is the world that Napoleon Bonaparte inherited when he seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in November of 1799. Now, here's the crucial point that most historians gloss over. Napoleon was not merely a gifted military commander. He was, perhaps more importantly, a financial reformer. One of the very first things he did after taking power was establish the Banque de France on the 18th of January, 1800. This was far more than a minor administrative decision. It was an attempt to rebuild the entire French financial system from the ground up. Napoleon understood something that his predecessors had failed to grasp. Political legitimacy required monetary stability. If the currency was worthless, no amount of revolutionary rhetoric or military victories could hold the nation together. The Banque de France was given the privilege of issuing bank notes, but unlike the disastrous assignats, these notes were convertible into gold and silver on demand. In 1803, Napoleon introduced the franc germinal, a new currency defined as 5G of silver or just over 290 milligrams of gold. This bimetallic standard would prove to be one of the most stable currencies in modern history, surviving without a single devaluation for more than a century, all the way until 1914. Napoleon's monetary system rested on three pillars: metallic backing that made overissuance mechanically difficult, institutional oversight through the Banque de France, and critically, the collective memory of the Assignat catastrophe, which made the French public deeply suspicious of any return to unbacked paper money. But Napoleon still faced a problem he could not solve. Even with a stabilized currency and reformed tax collection, France simply did not have the financial infrastructure to match Britain in a long war. Britain had the Bank of England, a sophisticated bond market, a deep pool of private investors willing to fund government debt, and most importantly, the Royal Navy, which protected British trade routes and ensured that revenue kept flowing in from the colonies. France possessed none of these advantages to the same degree. The French Navy had been devastated during the Revolution, and France's overseas colonies had been largely cut off or captured by the British. This is the fundamental asymmetry that drove everything Napoleon did, and it's the one thing that most historians failed to emphasize. Napoleon's military campaigns cannot be understood simply as acts of pure aggression. They were attempts to solve an economic problem that he could not solve through finance alone. Britain could afford to fight indefinitely because it could borrow indefinitely. France could not. So Napoleon had to find other ways to fund his wars, and more crucially, other ways to weaken Britain. And this brings us to the event that truly triggered the escalation of the Napoleonic Wars into a continent-wide catastrophe. It was not a battle. It was not an invasion. Instead, it was an economic blockade. On the 16th of May, 1806, the British Royal Navy imposed a full naval blockade of the French coast and all French allied ports. This was economic warfare in its clearest form. Britain was using its naval supremacy to strangle French trade, cut off French access to raw materials and colonial goods, and squeeze the French economy until it collapsed. Historians often frame this as a defensive measure, Britain protecting itself from the aggressive Napoleon. But the chronology matters. Britain imposed its measure first. The blockade came before Napoleon's continental system, not after it. Napoleon's response, the Berlin Decree of November 21st, 1806, was a retaliation. He declared that all British Isles were in a state of blockade and forbade France or any of its allies from importing British goods into Europe. He followed this with a Mellon Decree of December 1807, which ordered the seizure of any vessel trading with or sailing from any British port, even if the vessel belonged to a neutral country. Together, these decrees formed what we know as the Continental System, Napoleon's attempt to turn economic warfare back against Britain. Now, conventional historians treat the Continental System as evidence of Napoleon's overreach, his irrational desire to control all of Europe. But that completely misreads the situation. Scholar Alexander Mikaberidze has argued persuasively that Napoleon's continental system was not as irrational as some have claimed, but was rather a continuation of traditional policies of economic warfare that had been going on between Britain and France for over a century. Since the late 1600s, both nations had repeatedly used tariffs, blockades, and trade restrictions to undermine each other's economies. Napoleon was escalating a pattern that had already existed for generations. Consider the situation from Napoleon's point of view. After the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, where British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, Napoleon knew that a direct military invasion of Britain was impossible. He couldn't defeat the Royal Navy. He couldn't cross the English Channel. His remaining major weapon was economic pressure. If he could cut Britain off from European markets, he believed the British economy would collapse under the weight of overproduction. Factories would close, unemployment would skyrocket, gold reserves would drain, and eventually the British government would be forced to sue for peace. The idea was not inherently absurd. In fact, it came closer to working than is often assumed. By 1810, British exports had dropped dramatically. Gold reserves were falling. The manufacturing heartland of England was experiencing genuine economic distress. The continental system did strain the British economy, driving down exports and gold reserves significantly. In 1811, British exports fell to roughly £44 million. a severe decline. The crisis of 1811 was a real and dangerous moment for the British economy, exacerbated by poor harvests in 1809 and 1810 that drove up bread prices and fueled popular discontent. But here's where the story gets interesting and where the role of private finance becomes impossible to ignore. Britain didn't just survive Napoleon's economic warfare through government policy alone. It survived because of its financial system and specifically because of the private bankers who kept that system running. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British government formed and underwrote 7 coalitions against France. The total cost to Britain came to roughly £1.6 billion. Britain's national debt tripled during this period, ballooning from around £290 million to approximately £860 million. Of that, British subsidies paid directly to allied nations, Russia, Austria, Prussia, Portugal, Sweden, and others, totaled more than £65 million. But the subsidies weren't just cash transfers. They included staggering amounts of war supplies, weapons, uniforms, equipment, all mass-produced by British factories and shipped to allies across Europe. Britain was effectively financing other countries to continue fighting Napoleon. Consider the significance of that for a moment. Russia alone received £1.25 million in golden guineas for every 100,000 men it fielded against France. By 1814, the British war budget had reached £66 million in a single year, with £10 million going to the Navy, $40 million to the Army, and $10 million directly to Allied powers. This amounted to war financing on an industrial scale. No other state could match Britain at that scale. And at the center of this financial machinery sat a family that would become one of the most powerful in history: the Rothschilds. Nathan Mayer Rothschild, the London-based member of the 5 Rothschild brothers, had established himself as a critical intermediary between the British government and the money markets. When the Duke of Wellington needed funds to sustain his campaign against Napoleon in the Iberian Peninsula, the British government turned to Rothschild. Wellington needed roughly £100,000 every month by August of 1812, a sum with the purchasing power of more than £5 million today. The Rothschild brothers set up a network of agents across Europe who could buy up gold and silver coins from multiple countries and transfer them to Wellington in the form of local currency. Their operation was so efficient that by January of 1814, the British Commissary-in-Chief gave Nathan Rothschild formal authority to act as a government agent to collect funds across Germany, France, and Holland. The Rothschilds earned a 2% commission on these transfers, but that barely begins to capture the scale of their involvement. They were not simply transferring money, they were financing multiple sides of the conflict simultaneously. While Nathan funded the British war effort in London, his brother Jacob, based in Paris, maintained financial relationships with the French side. The Rothschilds' position of neutrality, their ability to operate across borders and across battle lines, gave them a unique and incredibly profitable position. Regardless of who won any given battle, the Rothschilds made money. Then came Waterloo. The legend goes that Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo a full 24 hours before the British government, thanks to his private network of couriers who used coded messages and carrier pigeons. Whether every detail of the famous Waterloo story is accurate has been debated by historians. But what is not disputed is that Rothschild had built a communication network faster than anything any government possessed. He had access to information before anyone else, and he used that information to trade on the London bond market. When the official news of Napoleon's defeat finally reached London, and British government bonds soared in value, Rothschild was positioned to reap enormous profits. By 1820, the Rothschilds were the most powerful banking family in Europe. Their credit network essential to any major government financial operation. At this point, one clarification is important. I am not arguing that the Rothschilds caused Napoleon's wars, or that they were pulling strings behind the scenes like puppet masters. That would amount to an overly simplistic and conspiratorial interpretation of history. The point is that the financial infrastructure that enabled Britain to fight Napoleon for 22 consecutive years, to fund 7 separate coalitions, to subsidize armies across the entire European continent, that infrastructure was not a minor detail of the war. It was the war. Without British finance, the coalitions against Napoleon would have collapsed. Russia couldn't have fielded its armies. Austria couldn't have rebuilt after its defeats. Prussia couldn't have armed its soldiers. Britain's money was the glue that held the anti-Napoleon alliance together, and private bankers like the Rothschilds were the ones who made that money flow. Napoleon himself understood this dynamic very well. He called the British subsidies to his enemies by a contemptuous name. He referred to them as the Golden Cavalry of St. George, the idea being that British gold coins stamped with St. George were doing more damage to France than any cavalry charge ever could. And his observation had real force. Napoleon won battle after battle, campaign after campaign, and yet he could never deliver the knockout blow because every time he defeated one coalition, Britain simply opened its checkbook and funded another one. This is the real tragedy of Napoleon's position, and it's the thing that most military historians completely fail to grasp. Napoleon's wars, in this interpretation, were not ultimately reducible to territory or ego. They were about a man trying to break a financial system that he could not compete with. Every major military decision Napoleon made in the later years of his reign can be traced back to this fundamental economic problem. Consider the Peninsular War, which began in 1807. Why did Napoleon invade Spain and Portugal? The standard explanation is that it was about enforcing the continental system since Portugal refused to comply with the trade ban on British goods. And that's true. But look one level deeper. Why was Portugal trading with Britain? Because Portugal's economy depended on it. Portugal's Atlantic trade routes were intertwined with British commerce. Cutting off trade with Britain would have devastated the Portuguese economy, so Portugal refused. Napoleon invaded to enforce his economic blockade, and the result was a 6-year quagmire that killed over 200,000 French soldiers and drained French resources at a time when Napoleon could least afford it. Or consider the invasion of Russia in 1812, the catastrophe that ultimately destroyed Napoleon's empire. Again, the conventional explanation emphasizes Napoleon's ego, his desire to punish Tsar Alexander for defying him. But the real cause was once again economic. Russia had joined the continental system after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, but the economic pain of complying was severe. Between 1807 and 1812, the continental system led to a roughly 1,300% increase in Russian national debt, a 50% drop in the value of the Russian paper currency, and a 40% decline in exports. Russian nobles were losing fortunes. The ruble was collapsing. By December of 1810, Tsar Alexander reopened Russian ports to neutral shipping, which was a thinly veiled restoration of trade with Britain. Napoleon faced a stark choice: either accept Russia's defection from the continental system, which would effectively destroy his entire economic strategy against Britain, or invade Russia and force compliance. He chose to invade. Not because he was a megalomaniac who couldn't resist conquest, but because his entire strategy for defeating Britain depended on keeping Russia in the economic blockade. It was a desperate gamble born of financial desperation, not battlefield ambition, and the outcome of that gamble is well known. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, roughly 600,000 men, and marched them into Russia in June of 1812. The Russians, rather than meeting him in a decisive battle, retreated, burning everything behind them in a scorched earth campaign that left Napoleon's army with nothing to eat, no shelter, and no way to sustain itself across the vast Russian landscape. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée stumbled back across the border in December, fewer than 100,000 men remained in fighting condition. The rest were dead, mostly from disease, starvation, and the brutal Russian winter. more than 500,000 casualties. It was the greatest military disaster in European history up to that point, and it was caused not by Napoleon's arrogance, but by the impossible economics of trying to fight a financial superpower without a financial system of your own. Now, there's another dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed, and it has to do with what Napoleon was actually trying to build. Because if you look beyond the battles and the blockades, Napoleon was attempting something genuinely revolutionary in the economic sphere. He was not only trying to damage British trade, he was also attempting to construct an alternative economic system for continental Europe. The Banque de France wasn't just for France. Napoleon established similar financial institutions in the territories he controlled. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, which standardized commercial law across much of Europe, making contracts more enforceable and property rights more secure. He built roads, bridges, and canals that connected previously isolated markets. He modernized tax collection. He introduced the metric system for weights and measures, which made cross-border trade far more efficient. In a very real sense, Napoleon was trying to build something like a European common market more than a century before the European Economic Community was established. He wanted a continental economy that was integrated enough to rival Britain's global trading empire. If he could create a self-sufficient European economy that didn't need British goods or British capital, then Britain's financial superpower status would become irrelevant. This is why the continental system, despite its obvious failures, wasn't as irrational as it's often portrayed. Napoleon wasn't just blocking British imports for spite. He was trying to force-grow European manufacturing to fill the gap left by British goods, and in some places, it actually worked. French cotton manufacturing expanded significantly during the period of the continental system, precisely because British competition had been eliminated. The difficulty was that the system also devastated French Atlantic ports like Nantes and Bordeaux, whose economies depended on overseas trade. It hurt France's own allies, who needed colonial raw materials that only Britain could supply, and it shifted the axis of European trade decisively inland, away from the coastal economies that had traditionally been the richest. The continental system was, in effect, the world's first comprehensive experiment in economic warfare and its most definitive failure. But its failure wasn't because the idea was inherently stupid. It failed because Napoleon couldn't enforce it without a navy, and because the human cost of enforcement, the invasions of Portugal, Spain, the Papal States, and ultimately Russia, made the cure worse than the disease. And this brings us to the deepest irony of Napoleon's story, the one that historians almost never discuss. Napoleon's ultimate defeat cannot be explained by the battlefield alone. He lost because he was playing a game that had been rigged against him from the start. Britain had spent more than a century building a financial system specifically designed to sustain long wars. The Bank of England, the bond market, the network of private bankers, the income tax introduced in 1799 specifically to fund the war against France, all of these instruments gave Britain a structural advantage that no amount of military genius could overcome. France, in contrast, had entered the modern era with a financial system that was medieval by comparison. The French monarchy had defaulted on its debts at least 3 times before 1780. The revolution had destroyed what little financial infrastructure existed, and even Napoleon's reforms, impressive as they were, couldn't close the gap in time. The Banque de France was established in 1800, but the Bank of England had been operating since 1694. More than a century of head start in building investor confidence and institutional expertise. Napoleon's war funding model was fundamentally different from Britain's and fundamentally weaker. While Britain borrowed from its own citizens through bond markets, Napoleon relied primarily on taxation and, crucially, on plunder. The French army funded itself through requisitions from conquered territories. After each victory, Napoleon would impose massive war indemnities on the defeated nation, strip its treasuries, and use that money to fund the next campaign. That model worked for as long as France continued winning, but the moment the victories stopped, the money stopped too. Unlike Britain, France couldn't borrow its way through a losing streak. The economic limits were becoming unmistakable. Napoleon's France could not win a long war, no matter how many battles he won. The retreat from Russia signaled the end because it revealed, once and for all, that the conquest and plunder model had reached its limits. There were no more wealthy nations left to conquer and strip. And here is where the story comes full circle, back to the broader question of what historians get wrong. The conventional narrative of Napoleon's wars focuses on battles, on generals, on strategy and tactics. It treats the wars as primarily military events driven by the ambitions of a single extraordinary individual. But once the financial foundations are examined, a substantially different picture emerges. Napoleon's wars were the final act of a century-long struggle between two economic systems. On one side stood the British model, built on public credit, private banking, naval supremacy, and global trade. This was a system that could sustain wars indefinitely because it could always find new sources of capital. On the other side stood the French model, which, despite Napoleon's reforms, was still fundamentally based on land taxation, military conquest, and territorial control. This was a system that could produce brilliant short-term victories, but could not sustain a prolonged conflict against a financially superior enemy. The coalitions that defeated Napoleon weren't held together by shared ideology or common fear. British money was a crucial force holding them together. Every single coalition against Napoleon was funded primarily by Britain. When Austria was defeated, British gold helped it rebuild. When Prussia was crushed, British subsidies helped it rearm. When Russia was exhausted, British payments kept its armies in the field. Without this constant flow of financial support, the coalitions would have disintegrated after every French victory, and Napoleon might well have achieved the lasting peace he claimed to want. This is also why Napoleon's final attempt at a comeback, the 100 Days in 1815, was doomed from the start. By that point, Napoleon had no economic base left. France was exhausted. The treasury was empty. When he returned from exile on Elba, Napoleon had to rely on massive emergency borrowing just to put an army in the field. His gambit at Waterloo was made possible only by a huge mobilization of popular support and frantic financial borrowing. Even if he had won the battle, there was no economic foundation to sustain a renewed empire. The financial superstructure that might have supported his ambitions had never existed in the first place. Now, I want to address one more thing that historians consistently get wrong about Napoleon's wars, and that's the question of who actually benefited. The standard narrative says that Napoleon was the aggressor and Britain was the defender of European liberty. But consider what followed Waterloo. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815 restored the old monarchies to power across Europe. The democratic and legal reforms that Napoleon had introduced, the Napoleonic Code, the abolition of feudal privileges, the modernization of civil law, many of these were rolled back by the restored kings and emperors. The people of Europe, who had briefly tasted legal equality and administrative efficiency under Napoleonic rule, were shoved back under the same aristocratic systems that had oppressed them for centuries. And who benefited most from Napoleon's defeat? The answer is clear. The British Empire entered the post-Napoleonic era as the undisputed global superpower. British trade dominated every ocean. The city of London became the financial capital of the world. The Rothschilds and their fellow banking dynasties became the de facto controllers of European sovereign finance. The concert of Europe, the security system established after Napoleon's defeat, was essentially a British-designed framework for maintaining the status quo and preventing any future challenger from disrupting the global order that enriched Britain so enormously. The national debt that Britain accumulated during the Napoleonic Wars, all 860 million pounds of it, became the engine of post-war economic development. As bond prices rose after 1813, the so-called wealth effect pumped enormous amounts of capital into the British economy. Investors who had bought war bonds at deep discounts now saw their portfolios surge in value. That wealth funded the final takeoff of the Industrial Revolution. The very war that nearly bankrupted Britain ended up making it richer and more powerful than ever. Put differently, the Napoleonic Wars weren't just a military conflict that Britain happened to win. They were a mechanism through which a specific financial system, the British model of public credit and private banking, achieved permanent global dominance. And that dominance persisted well into the 20th century until it was gradually replaced by the American system, which was itself directly descended from the British model, having been built on the same Dutch financial innovations that William of Orange had carried across the English Channel in 1688. So what do historians actually get wrong about Napoleon's wars? Almost everything that matters. They get the causes wrong by focusing on Napoleon's ambition, rather than the structural economic conflict between Britain and France that had been escalating for over a century. They get the nature of the conflict wrong by treating it as a series of military campaigns, rather than an economic war in which battles were secondary to financial stamina. They get the continental system wrong by portraying it as a rational overreach rather than a logical, if ultimately doomed, attempt to break Britain's financial stranglehold on Europe. They get the invasion of Russia wrong by framing it as megalomania, rather than a desperate attempt to enforce an economic strategy that was Napoleon's only viable weapon against British naval supremacy. And they get the outcome wrong by celebrating the defeat of a tyrant, rather than acknowledging that the real victors were the financial systems and banking dynasties that emerged from the war more powerful than any emperor had ever been. The Napoleonic Wars weren't caused by one man's ambition. They were the inevitable collision point between a centuries-old rivalry, a collapsing financial system, and a rising financial superpower. Napoleon was a brilliant general, an innovative administrator, and a transformative lawmaker, but he was also a man trapped by economics. He could win any battle, but he could never solve the fundamental problem that defined his era. He was fighting a country that could afford to lose 100 battles and keep coming back because it had a financial system that turned defeat into a temporary setback and victory into a permanent advantage. That, in this account, is the deeper origin of Napoleon's wars. Not simply glory, ego, or conquest, but money. The wars that helped shape the modern world were not decided by muskets and cannons alone. Bonds and balance sheets were also decisive weapons. And the echoes of that victory are still with us today in every central bank, every government bond auction, every international credit market. The financial architecture that defeated Napoleon became the foundation of the global economic order. And when you understand that, you understand not just the Napoleonic Wars, but the entire trajectory of modern history. If you have stayed with us this far, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really does make a difference and helps us keep making content like this. Also, if you enjoyed this story, check out our video on the Rothschilds and how they built a banking empire that reshaped the world. I think you'll find it fascinating. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.